Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you've joined me. On today's podcast, we're going to examine the consequences of the fall. Now, as I discussed last week, one of the things that happened as a result of the fall is that all of us learned to interpret life through a worldview that's not our friend. In fact, our worldviews are villains, keeping us trapped in this world's wisdom that is hostile to God's kingdom. Now, if you haven't listened to last week's podcast, I'll put a link to it below in the description. Now, in Genesis 2, the Bible tells us that the Lord planted a garden east in Eden and placed Adam in the garden to work and keep it. The garden was also filled with trees that bore fruit for Adam to eat. Now, only two trees were mentioned by name: the tree of life, which is in the center of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told Adam he could eat the fruit from every tree in the garden, except he couldn't eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the day he ate of it, he would surely die. Now, when I teach on the fall, I'm usually asked two questions. The first is, if God knew that Adam was going to eat of the fruit, why did he put that tree in the garden in the first place? And the second question is, why didn't God stop Adam from eating? When God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness," image and likeness wasn't vague or nebulous. God didn't sit back to see what type of image and likeness would develop in Adam organically and naturally as he went about keeping and working the garden. Image and likeness had already been defined in God's eternal purpose long before he created. Man was to bear the image and likeness of his son. Now, Adam wasn't ignorant of his call to be in the son's image and likeness. He knew God's will for his life, just like he knew God's will regarding the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He knew what God expected of him and how to satisfy God's heart. He was to live as the Son lives, solely dependent on the Father. He wasn't to live by fruit alone, so to speak, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. The Father entrusted his glory to the Son and wanted to entrust his glory to Adam as Adam came to abide in the Son's life. But there could be no negotiation over what constituted image and likeness. And Adam knew that. In fact, Adam knew everything God had said to him and about him. But knowing those things wasn't the same as choosing them when the choosing mattered. In Matthew, Jesus told the parable of the two sons. The father asked the first son to go work in the vineyard. The son answered that he would, but he didn't go. When the father asked the second son, he said he wouldn't go, but he changed his mind and went. You can say yes to God and believe that's enough, but the one who did the Father's will was the one who obeyed. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't designed to be a trap or a test. It was a choice. Which life would reign in Adam? Would he obey what he knew was true and allow the Son's life to reign in him? Or would he choose his own self-interest? So when Satan came into the garden to offer Adam another choice of life, for Adam, it was choosing time. Now, before Satan speaks to Eve, this is what the reader knows. Adam understood that there is a command associated with the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat it. But the command doesn't require blind obedience. God tells Adam why he can't eat of it. Because the fruit doesn't offer life, only death. Satan begins his temptation with a seemingly harmless question. Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? But the question wasn't harmless. There is a catastrophic destiny bound up in that question. When Eve answers, she signals her willingness to listen to what Satan has to say about what she can and can't eat. She tells him that she can eat of all the trees in the garden, but she isn't to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or even touch it, because if she did, she would die. Satan responded by telling her she had been misinformed. Eating the fruit couldn't bring death because it was the very source of image and likeness apart from the Son. He tells her, and don't forget, Adam is standing right there listening to every word, that if she'd be brave enough to eat, her eyes would be open and she would be like God. How? By knowing both good and evil. No one would have to tell her what she should or shouldn't do. That knowledge would belong to her, and she could make her own decisions. The fruit would bestow upon them personal autonomy. Now they would be armed with a knowledge they didn't have before, and that knowledge would allow them to break away from God and the limits He placed on them when He commanded them not to eat of the tree. For if God had truly given them free will, why did He obstruct their ability to choose with commands and callings? But if they ate of the fruit, they could determine for themselves what was good and what was evil, what was truth and what was a lie. The ability to discern and decide by themselves what was the best for them with no outside interference would be the very thing that would make them equal with God. But more importantly, they'd find that they now inherently and organically possess the same qualities the Son possessed: life, preeminence, and dominion. The purpose of their lives would no longer be spent in a lifetime of labor subduing the world for God's glory. No, they would be able to labor and subdue the world for their glory. All they needed to do was find the courage to overthrow the Son's government and establish their own. The fruit contained all the power and possibilities for them to live life on their terms with no interference from God. They'd become true kings just as God is a true king, for they'd be self-determining, self-governing, and self-actualizing. God knows this, Satan told them, and that's why He forbids you to eat of the fruit. When Eve saw that the tree was good for food and to be desired to make one wise, Satan knew he had won. For when he can influence your thinking and involve your emotions in the decision making, your will blindly follows. She took the fruit, ate it, and gave it to Adam, who also ate. Adam made his bid for supremacy and equality with God and lost everything. Now he did gain the knowledge of good and evil, but it became a curse and not a blessing. For Satan had left out something very important in his subtle arguments to them. The fruit could never give them image and likeness after themselves. It didn't have the power to do so. For image and likeness, as God defines it, is wrapped up in His Son's life. The only way to have Genesis 1:26 image and likeness was in and through the Son. The fruit only produced death because any life lived outside the Son's life is death. And death is defined as the ultimate frustration and futility of anything created outside of God's eternal purpose. Now, doesn't that right there describe the history of fallen man? Nothing remains, nothing lasts. Everything fallen man builds eventually falls apart and dies. God had told him the truth, but it was too late. They were image bearers, and they must bear someone's image. They could only watch in horror as Satan filled them with his nature, a nature bound and corrupted by death. Adam now lived under the total domination of Satan, sin, and death. The consequences of Adam believing Satan's lies are still felt today. Satan put God out of His place in creation. He took the dominion God gave to Adam and used it to create a world system that answers to him and actively opposes God as God works to rectify what has been lost. Satan took Adam and his descendants in hand and taught them what to think and then how to think about it. He hobbled all of us by persuading us that the self-centered way by which we now view life is the correct and proper view. Adam ate of the fruit and died. No, he didn't drop dead the moment he ate, but he did die to all God had prophesied over him before he was created. Adam and Eve's spiritual eyes were closed in that moment, and they no longer knew the intimacy they had in the garden. The heavenly realms were closed to them. And when God came walking in the cool of the evening, they were terrified of His presence and ran until they ran out of real estate, and then they hid themselves. And when God asked them what had happened, suddenly they were the victims of what someone else had done to them. They weren't responsible for their own actions. Eve said the serpent deceived her. Adam blamed Eve and God. Their soul eyes were opened, which meant they were now limited to this earthly realm. Their thinking became imprisoned by what they could see, hear, and feel. Death defined their lives. Death became the great foe man can never overcome. There's no coming back from death, and death now touched everything. Their minds were darkened, and reason and logic were enthroned. Truth fled from them just as the good had fled. Now good and truth were subjective and could change in an instant if it benefited them. That's the strength of the lie. As truth and good constantly change from generation to generation, from year to year even, fallen man has no clue that truth and good are objective and concrete and belong to God alone. But Adam did become all the things Satan promised. He became independent, self-actualized, self-determining, and self-governing. But he was created to be love as the Son is love. And now he has fallen from love into selfishness, which left him in a desperate search for love. The definition of love is that love doesn't seek its own way or love at the expense of others. The definition of selfish is a lack of consideration for others because the self is wholly preoccupied with itself. So how does man truly love and receive love in return when his constitution contradicts the meaning of love? Well, he really doesn't. And the world is filled with broken people desperate for love but unable to find it. The Bible tells us that God expelled Adam and Eve from the garden and placed a cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the tree of life. By doing so, God issued his verdict on fallen man. In Adam, all die. The door to the heavenly realms was closed and the way was barred. Once outside of Eden, what did Adam and Eve find? A world that was strange and alien to them. They had to learn everything from scratch, and the only skill Adam had was working and keeping the garden, so he now turned that skill to working and harvesting crops in a cursed earth. The fall meant their worldview had to be totally reordered so they could survive. They were like drowning men desperate for any lifeline that could save them from all they faced outside of God's presence. Now, the lifeline Satan threw to them was a false teaching that made them constantly think in terms of what about me. He taught them a way of thinking that they believed would lead to life, but was destructive to them on every level. And he sifted them like wheat for the sheer pleasure of doing so. One of the false teachings Satan taught humanity had to do with God's verdict on fallen man. A religious spirit was let loose that questioned whether the door to the heavenly realms was really closed and the way actually barred. How could God ignore man's worship and religious works? He couldn't, not really. And man-centered religion, where man decides on God's behalf what is and isn't acceptable when it comes to godly things, was birthed. This false teaching and religious spirit unleashed a great conflict upon the earth when it came to God's will and ways. This conflict is the context of the story of Cain and Abel. When studying this story, we need to remember that Cain didn't ignore or exclude God from his life. He recognized God as God and built an altar so he could worship him. As an offering, he selected the best of what he grew. And when he offered it, he fully expected his offering to be accepted. After all, he had given God the best fruits of his life. Nothing summed him up better than the crops he had labored and toiled over. He had done back-breaking, sweat-of-the-brow work to cultivate his crops, and when he looked over his fields, he knew he alone was responsible for what grew there. But his offering wasn't received. He found a closed door, and he grew sullen and angry by God's rejection of his offering and his good intentions in bringing it. But when God told him to bring an offering he knew would be accepted, he didn't listen. He refused to accept God's verdict that the door was closed to fallen man. Now, the closed door had passed to Abel also, but Abel accepted God's verdict. He knew he had nothing to offer in himself. Therefore, he'd have to come to God through another life, a life God would accept. That's why he offered a spotless lamb without blemish or mark. God received his offering. Cain represents everyone who seeks to be accepted by God on this basis. If I believe my offering is good and right, then God is obligated to accept it. But I have found that God won't accept an offering like that under any condition. I don't care how good my intentions were in bringing it. Abel represents all those who accept God's verdict on fallen man and seek to die to themselves so they can live by the life of another. Unfortunately, the story reached its climax when Cain slew Abel and God turned him into a fugitive and a wanderer. Cain went out of God's presence unrepentant. He didn't change his thinking and resentful. He then produced a civilization that had a fruitfulness separate from God. The flood was God's verdict on Cain's civilization. Now, as I wrap up, I want to bring this teaching back to your worldview. If you believe that your worldview is fundamentally sound and God just needs to tweak a perception here, a misconception there, and a thought here and there, you'll never grow into the mature son God intends for you to be. The only way to truly change your thinking is to repudiate what God has repudiated. And God has repudiated this fallen world. Nothing from it can stand before him. That's why in your fallen state, with your fallen thinking, you've nothing to bring to God that's acceptable to him. In Adam, your destiny is zero. It's futility and death. God has closed the door and barred the way to Adam and all his descendants. And God will not change his mind. So if you like this teaching and would like to hear more, please hit the subscribe button to be notified when the next podcast drops. And also hit the like button. This will help my algorithm and prompt you to share these teachings on other people's feeds. Now, over the next few weeks, I'll be examining the lives of men from the Old Testament to see how their worldviews impacted their walks with God. And I'm going to start with one of my favorites, Jacob. So I hope you'll join me next week. See you then. Bye.